Hello students, today I am going to talk to you about a new topic, the political narratives and political structure of early medieval India. While introducing this topic, I would like to draw your attention to the political scenario of the contemporary time. After the decline of the Guptas and the collapse of the Vakatakas, what we find in the Indian subcontinent a kind of an empty space. Within this empty space, some new ruling houses were trying to make their mark felt. Now, these ruling houses in northern India were originally the vassals of the Guptas, and similar examples can be found in the Deccan and beyond the Deccan too. Besides, we can note that as a result of the coming up of these new royal houses, there was a kind of a rise in regional power as well as the local powers. And the focus of political activities shifted from the Gangetic plains towards the Deccan and beyond that towards the land which is usually identified as the Tamilaham. Now, these new upcoming kingdoms did not really have a well-defined boundaries, and they mainly concentrated on the political centers. If we go by the designated areas and the extent of territories as enjoyed by these political houses, we will come across some powers which were comparatively more assertive in their reigns, and they were more expansive in their reigns, and these powers were the Rashtrakutas, the Cholas, the Palas, and the Gurjara Pratiharas. Apart from these houses, we also come across some of the smaller powers who enjoyed lesser territories and had modest resources. The interaction between the different ruling houses often resulted in confrontation, as well as there were alliances too. By going by this standard, historian Brajadulal Chattopadhyay has pointed out that there was no dichotomy between the political framework, that is, the formation of the state society and the coming up of these new lineages, that is to say, these new royal houses. In fact, the coming up of the new lineages were central to the formation of the political framework. Now, let us take an overview of the entire situation. While taking an overview of the entire situation, I'll try to discuss about what the noted historian Upinder Singh has to say. Upinder Singh has pointed out that during this phase, the formation of the state society was linked with high level of spatial mobility of the political elite, as well as we can also notice a very high degree of militarization. Now, as we'll go on with our discussion, we'll find that there were several wars fought during this period, and as a result of which the formation of the army was extremely important to these new political houses that were coming up during this period. While they were preparing these armies, while they were forming these armies, not only the centrally hired soldiers were taken, even the services of the mercenaries were also procured. Secondly, Upinder Singh has further pointed out that as a result of the process of state formation, we find a kind of a confrontation between the tribal communities and the Brahminical cultures, as a result of which some of the tribal communities lost their identity or their previous independent existence, and they became formalized farmers or peasants, as we may prefer to call them. And several contemporary inscriptions point out that there were a lot of confrontations between tribal culture and Brahminical culture. On the other side, we also come across such tribal rulers who established their dominance, and by passing through a process of Sanskritization, they adapted Hinduized customs. Further, we also notice a kind of I should say, a political hierarchy which was very clear-cut during this period. Talking about the political hierarchy, I would come to the terminologies that were used. Say, for example, for the higher-ups in the political ladder, we come across such terms as Maharaja Dhiraj, Param Bhattaraka, and Parameshwar, and such other terms. While talking about the subordinates, we come across such terms as Shamantas, Mahashamantas, Ranako, and so on. During the early medieval period, both horizontal and vertical linkages of political power was more clear-cut than the earlier period. The emergence of the political elite and their collaboration with the landed groups, and these landed groups who were gradually assuming a lot of power as a result of the land grants that they received. This, in turn, became an important factor of the political narrative of this period. Further, I would like to highlight an interesting point that in spite of the patriarchal form of society, we find the presence of few queens. For example, we find the presence of such queens in Kashmir and also in the Chalukya dynasty. Now I'll come to the political process that was involved in this period. While talking about the political narrative of any phase of Indian history, what is the main focus of the historians is that the existence of an empire, and that empire governed by a supreme ruler. The governance of a large-scale empire by the supreme ruler who is establishing his dominance over the weaker neighbors is a very important factor of the political scenario of different phases of Indian history. It is usually identified that the presence of such a supreme ruler results in order, discipline, peace, harmony, coexistence of several elements. However, in early medieval India, we do not find the existence of such a paramount power. As a result, many historians have tried to define this as a kind of a deviation. Why is this called a deviation? Because absence of a supreme ruler who is the symbol of order or peace or harmony is interpreted as a kind of a disorder, a chaos, resulting in a crisis. So many historical interpretations, they see or they interpret the early medieval Indian history as a period of chaos and disorder. However, this is not always the accepted view, because non-conformation to that framework does not necessarily mean the coming of a chaotic order. Brajadula Chattopadhyay has pointed out that if we try to interpret early medieval Indian history from this perspective of a disorder or chaos, we would notice a kind of an oscillation between a centralized polity and the political instability which is released by the centrifugal forces. Now, I'll come to three models by which we can sort of analyze the political narrative of early medieval Indian history. First, I'll talk to you about the feudal polity. Since the 1950s, several Marxist historians, they have come up with a new interpretation in terms of which they tried to analyze the progress of Indian history. According to their interpretations, the complexities of the early medieval Indian history cannot be simply analyzed by the terms of dynastic shifts. The socio-economic factors had to be taken into consideration. In this context, I would refer to the works of D.D. Kosambi, who comes forward with the basic feudal interpretation regarding the political narrative of early medieval Indian history. Kosambi suggests two kinds of feudalism. Number one, feudalism from the above. In this context, we find a direct relationship between the ruler and the peasants, and there is no existence of any intermediary stage between the two. Number two, feudalism from the bottom. This is a more complex phenomena where we find that in between the ruler and the peasant, there is an intermediary landed class who keep on interfering into the political scenario as well as the socio-economic framework. Now, apart from Kosambi's interpretation, we also come across R.S. Sharma's version of this feudal polity. R.S. Sharma links up the understanding of the feudal political setup with the changing socio-economic and cultural situations in the early medieval times. Sharma suggests that 400 CE to 1200 CE, this period is marked by significant changes in the socio-economic and political scenario, which resulted in the formation of a feudal mode or a feudal polity. And in this context, Sharma refers to a very interesting phase of or a very interesting feature of early medieval Indian history, which is the issuance of land grants. These land grants is given due importance not only by the Marxist historians but by the critics of the Marxist interpretations too. Land grants definitely makes a mark in the progress of early medieval Indian political history. As the political authority of the rulers started declining, they started donating lands mainly to the religious donis, that is the Brahmins, and in course of which the Brahmins not only gained wealth, but they also gained a lot of administrative and judicial power. These land grants were known as the Brahmodayas, that is the land granted to the Brahmins, and according to R.S. Sharma's interpretation, this resulted in the erosion of royal authority and the fragmentation of power, which resulted in the decline of several economic factors like the decline in urbanization, decline in trade and commerce, decline in industry, and so on. So the picture was not very hopeful as such. A critique of the feudal polity is introduced by the other groups of historians. First, I'll refer to what historian Upinder Singh has to say regarding this. According to Upinder Singh, she actually raises two questions as to whether there was really that sort of fragmentation in early medieval Indian history, as has been pointed out by the advocates of the feudal polity. Secondly, she also raises the question as to whether the royal houses would voluntarily give away a part of their authority by providing the land grants. What Upinder Singh is suggesting that in the post-Gupta era, we can notice an unprecedented level of political activities resulting in the multiplicity of state formations, both at the regional, sub-regional, as well as in the trans-regional levels. There was also a kind of an agrarian expansion too. So according to her, there was not really a kind of a fragmentation that we can witness during this period, but on the contrary, we can see the coming up of many regional and local powers, and the Brahmanas who were granted with the Brahmodeya's lands were becoming a support system for the rulers and not their adversaries as such. Now I'll talk to you about Bartenstein and his model of the segmentary state. Bartenstein has based his study on the anthropologist Aidan W. Southall's work, and he has applied this model to South India, in particular to the Chola kingdom. What Bartenstein is trying to analyze is that the state of affairs that we find in early medieval India, and particularly in South India, did not refer to any unitary state. Power was extremely segmented. That's what Bartenstein is arguing. Now, what is the features of this segmentary state? Number one, there are multiple political domains. Number two, all these multiple political domains had autonomous power and coercive as well as administrative authorities. The king had a dual level of authority, one at the actual political authority and secondly at the ritual level. However, the king was basically an anointed one because he didn't have the support of a revenue system or as such that of a standing army. Besides, the organization of this segmentary state was pyramidal in structure with interrelation between the central forces as well as the peripheral areas. Bartenstein's argument on the basis of the construct of the Chola kingdom has not been accepted by other historians. R. Champak Lakshmi has pointed out that within the Nadu administration, the people who were working often received such ornamental titles like Brahmo Rayans, Pallava Rayans, because this was a kind of then identification of the service that were offered by them. But this necessarily did not mean that there was a kind of a confrontation between the royal authority and the recipients of such titles. But Bartenstein is trying to imply that as a result of this kind of division of power, there was no integrative force working in early medieval India. He doesn't use the term early, but refers to the entire phase as the medieval Indian history. Bartenstein's argument has further been criticized both by Hermann Kulke and Brojadulal Chattopadhyay. I'll come to what Hermann Kulke has to say about the formation of integrative state during this period. According to Kulke, after the decline of the Gupta Empire and the kingdom of Harshavardhan, there was the coming up of a lot of states, and a process was going on of continuous agrarian expansion and political integration. Kulke particularly refers to certain features of this phase. There was the formation of a local nuclear area, which was actually the starting point of the formation of state. Then this was followed by the surrounding peripheral zones. Across the peripheral zones, there were the neighboring areas of original independent rulers who are often known as the Shamantos. And beyond that, there was a process by which we can find the formation of chiefdom, early kingdom, and imperial kingdom. In Sanskrit terminology, these three successive stages of state formation evolved round the coming of the king, that is the Raja, then the great king, that is the Maharaja, and finally the supreme king of the great king, that is the Maharajadhiraja. Kulke identifies 4 more factors in analyzing the entire political process. There was the foundation of this nuclear area and a concentration of power in the nuclear area. In the second stage, the nuclear area penetrated into the peripheral zones and went beyond the peripheral zones into the neighboring area, as a result of which the imperial kingdom was formed, and everything had a kind of a ritualistic sanction too, because the rulers who are coming up at this stage, the regional rulers, they are always looking for some kind of a political regionalization. Therefore, the state formation appears to be a continuous process and not something static. Political narrative reflected diachronic development rather than synchronic ones. In Kulke's opinion, this can be called a processual method, which has been termed by Upinder Singh as a processual method too. And this was rather coming from the inside than being enforced from the outside domain. Next, I'll come to what Brajadulal Chattopadhyay has to say regarding this integrative model. Brajadulal Chattopadhyay is definitely a critic of the feudal model as well as the segmentary state model as forwarded by Barton Stein. According to Professor Chattopadhyay, while we are studying the polity of a particular time space of a particular country, we have to look into the nature, the organization, and the distribution of power. This is absolutely essential. What appeared as political fragmentation to many historians was reinterpreted by Professor Chattopadhyay as a kind of a political integration, in course of which the regional powers, they were trying to go beyond the urge for the search of imperial control or imperial domination. The political process, as analyzed by Professor Chattopadhyay, is as follows. A. In the post-Gupta period, the state society, represented by the emergence of ruling lineages, covered not only the nuclear regions but went beyond that, covering the peripheral zones. Since the 7th century, we come across several inscriptions which reflect detailed genealogies. And in these genealogies, we find that they were connecting the royal houses with some mythological figures, mythological heroes. And this was a kind of an attempt to give a legitimization to the regional powers that were coming up at this point of time. Secondly, Professor Chattopadhyay refers to the shift from the practice of Yajna to the practice of Vangsha. practice of Jaggo refers to that time when such rituals or such sacrifices at the Ashwamedha Jaggo or the Rajaswa Jaggo, which are integral parts of the spread of imperial power, the spread of the empire. But now there is a shift from that, and a new interpretation of the domain of political power was coming when due importance was given to the lineages or the Vangshas. Besides, this change, the pace of change from this Jaggo to Vangsho was not always very uniform in all the areas, and it remained uneven, sort of. Further, Professor Chattopadhyay argues that on the basis of researches on the political history of this period, we cannot come to a very definite conclusion, but we can refer to certain factors, just like as the overlord who emerged from a local base, when he tried to transcend and move into a supra-local base, he had to take the help of other lineages, whether that was military help or otherwise. Secondly, it also required a redistribution of resources acquired through the process of expansion via a system of ranking. So now I come to the point of ranking. It should be brought to notice that both these factors, land grants as well as ranking, they became important tools of generating power in early medieval Indian history. And this also resulted in the transformation of the Samantas in course of the process as they gained more and more power. Ranking thus became a vital component as well as the land grant in the early medieval political system. Further, we should remember that this phase of Indian history was an intermediary phase, a prelude to the actual medieval phase when a greater control of the nobility and a regulated system of service assignment could be identified. Finally, I come to the conclusion of this discussion, and in conclusion, I would like to draw your attention to certain factors. What we find in the political narrative of this entire phase, that the historians were coming up with certain models, like the feudal model or the segmentary state model, and which were quite not really complementary to each other. And again, these two models were criticized by the advocates of the integral state model. So what we find that through these different type of models, several factors are being highlighted, like the socio-economic factors of this period of Indian history, the polity, the cultural movements, the shift in the religions, and so on, and similar factors. Historian Ranabir Chakraborty thinks that if we try to judge this period only from the perspective of disintegration, segmentation, or fragmentation, then we cannot do proper justice to the essence which is embedded within the political narrative of the era, of this era. According to Professor Chakraborty, from 300 CE to 600 CE, we can notice that there is a slow process going on, and this process was that of the formation of a state. And this process gained pace during the later period. So, instead of interpreting this period as a breakdown of a centralized system of administration, we can identify it as a state where the several regional and local powers made their mark. They became a kind of an alternative structure as we find in the pre-600 CE era. The growth and development of these regional and local power bases could be seen as an outcome of the spread of the state society, the availability of land resources, the absorption of the tribal society into Jati Varna system, and the consequent interplay of tribal cults and Brahminical pantheon. The idea of a political crisis thus seemed to fade in the context of the integrative polity active in the political life of early medieval Indian history.